Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Amen. Through many years as university chaplain, I officiated at lots and lots of weddings, more than I can count. And I have met with couples not only to work out the details of the ceremony, but also to do premarital counseling. The wedding, I would tell them, is just a one-day celebration. Being married means that you're in it for the long haul. There are obviously many joys in being married, but making a marriage work requires considerable effort and a lot of intentionality. It doesn't just happen by magic. At some point in those conversations, I would ask couples how they deal with conflict. And I remember one couple, they smiled at me and said, "Oh, we don't have conflict." I remember being quite skeptical. In fact, I was a little shocked. Do they even talk to one another, I wondered? Do they even know one another? How can two people be in such a close relationship and never have conflict? Has one of you ever said the wrong thing or done something to hurt the other? Or failed to do something that you should have done? Have you never had a significant disagreement or difference of opinion? I thought maybe they were just naive, or maybe they were just caught up in some fantasy of romantic bliss, untroubled by the reality that marriage can sometimes be challenging. I'd like to believe that what they meant when they said that they never had conflict was that they didn't fight. They didn't raise their voices or say nasty things or throw any dishes. I would like to think that what they meant was that whenever they had a disagreement or whenever they felt hurt or whenever they messed up somehow, they were able to talk about it calmly and work things out. It just didn't feel like anything so disruptive as conflict. Maybe they recognized the difference between having a conflict and having a fight. I hope that's what they meant. As far as I can tell, conflict is bound to happen when human beings live together, even when they care deeply about one another. It's inevitable. As Lysander says in A Midsummer Night's Dream, the course of true love never did run smooth. Different human beings see things differently. There is diversity of opinion. Misunderstandings create obstacles between us. Human beings somehow hurt one another, whether intentionally or unintentionally. When we live together as a couple or as a family, we often find ourselves in need of mending. It takes a lot of care, takes a lot of attention to repair the broken places in our common life. In our gospel reading for this day, Jesus talks about what it means to live with our sisters and brothers in the church. It's a reminder that Christian faith is lived in community with other people. We might be tempted to think that faith is just a personal matter between me and God. I can just go off by myself, watch a beautiful sunset, take a walk along the lake shore, and think peaceful thoughts. To be sure, there are times when we need to be alone with God. The Gospels tell us that Jesus himself needed those times of private contemplation and prayer. But in today's Gospel reading, Jesus is teaching us that faith happens in community when 2 or 3 are gathered in his name. What happens when there is conflict in the community of the faithful? A rupture in the fabric. What happens when one member hurts another member? What happens when members disagree with one another to the point of being disagreeable? Jesus reminds us that when we join the church, we become part of a family. That's how Jesus talks about us. If a brother or sister sins against you, by the way, that's a better translation than if a church member sins against you. And we know that families can be a little weird, sometimes even annoying. But our families can also be precious. We need a family to teach us about life, to pick us up when we fall down or when we're having a tough time. In a family, we learn to say us and ours rather than just me and mine. Preacher Barbara Brown Taylor says, "A healthy family has a way of smoothing out our rough edges by making us rub up against each other like tumbling pebbles in a jar. Living with other people, we learn that we cannot have everything our own way. We learn to compromise, giving up some of the things we want so that other people can have some of the things they want. And while it's never easy, learning this give and take is part of learning to be fully human." So says Barbara Brown Taylor. One time we had a small panel discussion on Christian nonviolence at Northwestern. We talked about the great debate within the church over issues of nonviolence. It's something that we Christians have disagreed about for a very long time. The arguments have often been quite intense. The church as a whole has been divided through the centuries on this question of nonviolence. Is the use of violence ever justified? What the panelists agreed about was that the practice of nonviolence is just too difficult for any individual Christian to sustain in isolation. One of our speakers was a Mennonite who had registered as a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War. He fulfilled his alternative service obligation by going to Vietnam to work on relief and literacy programs. He described himself as someone who is trying to be a pacifist. He said that he had to acknowledge his own violent inclinations, his own doubts and struggles, even after all these years. And he said that he needed the support of others to remain faithful to what he most believed to be right. Even though the community of faith is fallible and often misguided, we need to be in company with others to help us remain faithful and committed. We need each other. Sometimes authentic Christian faith is just too hard for any of us to sustain by ourselves. In the church, we are bound by a covenant. And this is not just fanciful preacher talk. At First Congregational, our church bylaws constitute a legal document that spells out how we relate to one another as members of this church. We can expect certain things from one another, and certain things will be expected of us. Our covenant with one another means that we are bound to one another spiritually, but also in many practical ways. We may be an odd assortment of people, but we have been thrown together. And the expectation is that some interesting things will happen as we work out our life together. Friends, we are living in a time of divisiveness and polarization. With all that is happening in our world, many people are afraid of one another, upset by one another, angry at one another. Our dollar bill says, E pluribus unum, out of many, one. But these days it seems to be more pluribus than unum. Everywhere we look, we see opposition. People view one another with suspicion. Those people over there, they're a threat to our way of life. They're a threat to our safety. Perhaps the special calling of the church in our day is to be a place of reconciliation, a place where people can talk honestly about the ways they are feeling hurt, the ways they are discouraged, the ways they are afraid. A place where healing can be experienced and offered to the world. A place that models the way of reconciliation and peace. I'm very fond of the writer Wendell Berry. Wendell Berry writes novels and poems and essays. He's also an environmental activist and a farmer. I especially like his novel called Jayber Crow. The main character, Jayber Crow, tells the story of his own life in the small community of Port William, Kentucky. Born in 1914, he leads a rather ordinary life. He eventually becomes the town barber, grave digger, and church custodian. In many ways, it's a story about the struggle to find and maintain a viable faith. Jayber is skeptical about the church. He says that he has concluded that Christ did not come to found an organized religion, but came instead to found an unorganized one. In a remarkable passage, Jayber articulates a vision of the gathered church, a gathered community in which we are compacted together forever, even by our failures, our regrets, and our longings. This church community is imperfect and irresolute, but held together by the frayed and always fraying, incomplete and yet ever holding bonds of the various sorts of affection. It was a community always disappointed in itself, disappointing its members, always trying to contain its divisions, and always trying to gentle its meanness, always failing, and yet always preserving a sort of will toward goodwill. And then Jaber goes on to say, my vision gathered the community as it never has been and never will be gathered in this world of time. For the community must always be marred by members who are indifferent to it or against it, who are nonetheless its members, and maybe nonetheless essential to it. And yet I saw them as somehow perfected beyond time by one another's love, compassion, and forgiveness. As it is said, they may be perfected by grace. Friends, Jesus has commissioned us to be the church with all our flaws and our prickliness and all our brokenness. But Jesus has also given us a powerful promise. Where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I'm there with them. Amen. And thanks be to God who makes it so.